Hello, everyone. I'm glad to meet you. As you've heard from the introduction, I'm a scholar at the University of Toronto. I'm originally from Manitoba in Western Canada, and I'm a child, a grandson of the oldest wave of Ukrainian immigrants who came to this country between 1896 and 1914. So this is a personal concern to me, this general subject. And being a historian, I thought it would be important for me to say something about Ukrainian Canadian history. And so that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to talk about Ukrainian Canadian history, and I'm going to use the history of Canada's foreign policy towards the Soviet Union as a kind of and Canada's policy toward the Soviet Union as a kind of skeleton around which I will wrap the general history of Ukrainian Canada as I see it. So I suppose we can get into it now. So today's topic is shortened thus: Ukrainian Canadian history and Canada's foreign policy. And can we have slide 2, please? So this is the first slide. It's taken from the Illustrated History of Ukraine by Paul Robert Mogotchi, and it shows a map of what Ukraine looked like in the 19th century. Of course, at that time, there was no state called Ukraine on the map, but Ukrainian ethnic territory is marked out very clearly on this map, and you can see how it extends north from the Black Sea, west towards what was then the Austrian Empire, and right into that empire, into the Austrian crown land of Galicia, which was inhabited, the eastern half, primarily by Ukrainians, and extends east beyond the borders of today's Ukraine and beyond the borders of the area presently occupied by the Russians into the Kursk and Voronezh oblasts, or regions, east of the Ukrainian-Russian border, and south as well to the area called the Kuban, which is just on the east side of the Sea of Azov. And that's where the Black Sea Cossacks lived, as they were called in the late 19th century. These were descendants of the old Zaporozhian Cossacks of central Ukraine. So they were still speaking Ukrainian at that time, and that's quite important because when in 1917 revolution broke out, all of these people could identify with the Ukrainian National Republic that was declared at that time. So there we have it, divided Ukraine in the 19th century, not exactly on the map, but you can see that broken line towards the left-hand side of the screen, where the Austrian Empire controlled the west and the Russian Empire controlled all of the east and center. Okay, so that's 19th century Ukraine. Can we have the next slide, please? So this is a close-up of the crown land of Galicia and Lodomeria, as it was formerly called, Kingdom of Galicia and Lodomeria, and the Emperor of Austria was called the King of Galicia and Lodomeria. That was a formal title. It wasn't used in everyday parlance. And you can see on this map that extends west towards and includes it at the end of the 19th century, the city of Krakow, the old capital of Poland, and eastward right up to Bukovina in the south there, which is another Austrian province, and the Zbruch River, which was the border between the Russian Empire and the Galician Kingdom. Now, this is important because, and it's important for Ukrainian Canadian history, because at the end of the 19th century, a man by the name of Osip Ilescu, an agronomist in an institution in Lviv, or Lemberg, as it's called in this map, that's the German title, organized the first groups of settlers to go to Western Canada. And that started in 1896. And the way was prepared by Ivan Franko himself, the great Ukrainian writer and political activist, great socialist, as he was at that time. He prepared the way by making a tour of that part of Galicia, this eastern part, this southeastern part that's you can see next to Bukovina there and next to Russia. That corner, if you can circle it with your pen, Mr. Editor. So the towns were called Zalizjike, Husiatin, Borshchiu, Shortkiu, all these places. And those of you who are in the audience listening and can trace their origins to the first great immigration of Ukrainians to Canada will probably trace their origins to this little corner of Galicia. So that's Galicia. Next slide, please. Now, I wanted to give you a document from those times just to show what it was like and a little bit of personal contact as well. These are 3 pages from the passport of my grandfather on my father's side. My name is Plemak, as it's pronounced in Ukrainian, and his was as well. His first name was Andriy. And you can see on the first page to the left, it says in German at the top, it says, "In Namen seiner Majestät Franz Josef Erst," in the name of His Majesty Kaiser Franz Josef I. And underneath it, it says the same thing in Polish. And Andrei's name is written in Latin letters there. He's the holder of the passport. Underneath that, something else is written. I can't quite make that out, but below that is the little village from which he came, which is called Koszaliwsi. And that was near the town of Zalizjike different district. And the very, very bottom, it says Galitzin in German. That's the first page. The second page is a physical description of my grandfather. He was born in 1883, and he was relatively average for that time, average in height. And he had darkish hair and all that. And all of this is recorded there. And there at the bottom, you can see his signature. His signature is recorded here in his own language, which was at that time called Ruthenian. And in the Ruthenian script that was used by the forefathers of the Ukrainians at that time. And so it's in Ruthenian Cyrillic script. And those of you who can read Cyrillic can see that it's Andriy Plemak. And then the final page tells us that this passport is good for 3 years and immigration to Canada, and is dated April 8th, 1910. At the bottom, you see the seal of the Imperial Austrian House, and at the very top right-hand corner, there's a stamp there called with 30 Heller, 30 Hellers, which was like pennies, and on the stamp is a portrait of Franz Josef himself. So this gives you a feel for that time. It was the Austrian Empire, Austro-Hungary as was sometimes called, and the first Ukrainians who came to Canada called themselves Ruthenians, and were called by others generally Galician. Okay, next slide, please. Now, when they came to Canada in the 1890s and right up until the First World War, they settled along the northern rim of the prairies in this great arc that you can see southeast at the bottom there, going northwards, right until you get to the Peace River country in Alberta at the far west, and that's the last area actually to be settled by Ukrainians in Canada. So that's the general topography of the land, and they settled there for a reason, very good reason. In the old country, it was customary, it was the law actually, that the peasants had to pay the landlords for the use of firewood in the forests, because the peasants did not own the forest, the landlords did. So they had to pay the landlords for the wood, for construction and for burning and all this sort of thing. In Canada, the land was pretty much free. They could have gotten much better land on the open prairie, but they decided to go for the poplar belt, where there were bunches of poplars every now and then, so, stands of trees that they could use for building materials. And so that's why they settled along the entire northern edge of the prairie there. Another reason was the railroad. One of the railroads went through that area. I think it's the CNR today. So that's the general topography and the demography of the Canadian prairies, and something about the first settlers in Canada. Okay, next slide, please. Now, great changes occurred with the First World War. First of all, the bishop of the time, the Ruthenian Greek Catholic bishop of the time, whose name was Budka, declared when the war started that all the Ruthenians in Canada of military age should go back and help His Majesty Franz Joseph I to fight his enemies, because that was the custom. Bishops did that in those days. But he was put in a very difficult position when a few days later, the British Empire declared war on Germany and on Austria-Hungary. Suddenly, the Galicians in Canada were on the opposite side and were declared enemy aliens. So the bishop had to change his mind very quickly and put out another circular letter asking the Galicians in Canada to be loyal to the British Empire and not to the Austrian monarch. So that was a very embarrassing way to start the war, but that's the way it started for them. And a number of difficulties ensued. Not only did recent immigrants lose their status as Canadians, but they had to register. They had to register as enemy aliens. That was actually the title. And this registration was carried out across the prairies. They lost citizenship rights. Eventually, they lost voting rights. Some were interned in prison camps. Mostly the indigenous, the poor people, the people who were trying to go to the neutral United States. It was still neutral at that time. And so they were arrested. Also, some people who were just plain down and out and didn't have anywhere else to go, they were taken away and put in these camps. All in all, there were about 6,000 or 7,000 of them. They were generally labeled Galicians. But they weren't all Ruthenians. There were also some Poles who were from Galicia, and some of them wound up in the camps as well. And there were others as well. There were Jewish people coming and German people coming from Galicia were all called Galicians in that time. This is something we forget. Now, as the war progressed, eventually the Germans knocked the Russians out of the war. There was a revolution in Russia, and the Tsar's regime collapsed. The Ukrainian leadership declared itself autonomous, and then eventually a republic was formed. And that was when the name Ukrainian really got started, really took off. Because suddenly there was a Ukraine on the map. Ukraine was a political conversation and everything. And one of the most important people in this political conversation was the greatest Ukrainian historian of them all, Mikhailo Hrushevsky, who came from central Ukraine but taught in Lemberg, or Lviv as it is known today, which was the capital city of Galicia. And so he was kind of like a symbol for the unity of all Ukraine, and he was a great propagator of the Ukrainian name. And he even wrote a booklet called "Who Are the Ukrainians and What Do They Want?" So he had to explain this to people because most people had never heard of Ukrainians before. So that's Mikhailo Hrushevsky and the beginning of this very, very important change in name from Galician, Ruthenian to Ukrainian. Can we have the next slide, please? Now, the First World War and the Revolutionary War ended with the division of Ukraine between Poland in the west and the Soviet Union in the east. The Ukrainians in Canada, of course, mostly came without the national name, but they came to Canada before the war. But now their homeland was no longer under the Austrians. This was under the Poles, the Republic of Poland, the newly created Republic of Poland. The Ukrainians in Galicia did try for independence, but they failed, and they were militarily defeated by the Poles. So the Poles took over the area. And throughout the interwar era, the Ukrainians in Canada, who were increasingly aware of their nationality and aware of their new name and calling themselves Ukrainians, pushed as much as possible for rights to be given to their compatriots inside Poland. So this became a political difficulty. And there were two important points that I should make about this relation between the Republic of Poland and the Dominion of Canada. Firstly, was the Railroad Agreement of 1925. By that agreement, the Canadian Railways took over the immigration question from the government and recruited settlers from Poland. And they recruited them mostly from old Galicia, from those southeastern provinces of the new Republic of Poland. That's the first point. And this occurred mostly between 1925, the beginning of the agreement, and 1930, the onset of the Depression. So most of the second wave of Ukrainians to Canada, all of them bearing the new name, almost all of them bearing the new name Ukrainian, occurred between 1925 and 1930. The second point to make about this interwar era is that the Poles, as part of their agreement with the victorious Allies at the end of the Second World War, agreed to hold, to give some autonomy, national autonomy to the Ukrainians in Poland, in that part of Poland, that southeastern part of Poland. They never did that. That agreement was called the Ambassadors' Agreement of 1923. And because they never did that, there was always dissatisfaction among the Ukrainians in Poland. They wanted some national rights. They wanted to have their own schools. They wanted to have some autonomy, and they never got it. So the struggle continued, a struggle which has started between the Poles and Ukrainians during the war, continued afterwards, and by other means they continued. During the war, it was military conflict. After the war was an underground organization called the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. So they carried out sabotage and things like that against Polish targets, trying to force the Poles to give autonomy to the Ukrainians in Poland, and independence is what they really wanted, but they would take whatever they could get. And there was a member of parliament by this time by the name of Michael Luchkovich. He was from Alberta. He was a little bit left-wing, but he was supported Ukrainian national independence, and he spoke up in the Parliament of Canada in favor of national rights and criticizing Polish actions during 1930, when there was a huge campaign of what the Poles called pacification of the Ukrainians, and was basically destroying Ukrainian organizations and arresting Ukrainian activists, all this sort of thing. So Luchkovich stood up in the Parliament of Canada and criticized Poland for doing this. He got the attention of the Prime Minister of the time, whose name was Bennett. And he also got support from Wordsworth, the founder of the CCF-NDP in Canada, J.S. Wordsworth, very sympathetic to the Ukrainians at that time. So those are the two important points about Luchkovich and Poland. Okay, next slide, please. This tension between Poles and Ukrainians continued until the First World War, or the Second World War, rather. The war breaks out, and there's problems because the Ukrainians by this time in Canada are very, very divided between those who supported the nationalist ideal of a free and independent Ukraine and then those who supported the Soviet Union. Now, when the war broke out, at first, the Soviet Union was a little bit in favor of the Nazis, actually. There had been a non-aggression pact between Hitler and Stalin signed just on the eve of the war. And when Hitler attacked Poland, 2 weeks later, the Soviets attacked from the east, and they divided the country between them. So during this early stage of the war, because the communists were sort of dealing with the Nazis and made agreement with them, the nationalists supported the war. They were in favor of the war. They wanted to fight. They wanted to fight the communists most of all, but they wanted an independent Ukraine, and they thought, maybe we can work something out with the Nazis, but we'll eventually turn against them and use whatever they provide us with to fight the Soviets. So they were on board with the war when it broke out until June 22nd, 1941, when Hitler made his surprise attack on the USSR. And this is a page from Kanadiyski Farmer, the largest circulation Ukrainian newspaper in Canada at that time. The communists might have had one that was about the same circulation, maybe a bit bigger. I don't really know. But this was certainly the biggest non-communist Ukrainian newspaper in Canada at that time. And the headlines reads, Vybuchla Russeysko-Nemetska Vina, a Russian German war has broken out. And down below it, it says, Britannia obiecaya dati Sovietam pomich, which means Britain has decided to give the Soviets help. Well, this was very difficult for the nationalists because suddenly they were on the same side as the Soviet Union, their sworn enemy. On the other hand, the communists suddenly were supporting the war. They had objected to it before because they were pro-communist, right? And the communists had a deal with Hitler. Now suddenly they were supporting the war because the Soviets were fighting Hitler. So the tables had turned. So the first part of the war was difficult for the nationalists. The first part rather was difficult for the communists. The second part was very good for the communists, and they enjoyed prestige at that time. And Stalin was usually referred to in Canada as Uncle Joe. It was not the terrible dictator, but the guy who's fighting Hitler. So, and during this time, it was very, very difficult for the Ukrainians in Canada, the non-communists, to see themselves allied with the Soviets, who held the bulk of their homeland in kind of like a captivity in their view. So the next slide, please. Now, by 1944, they had figured out a strategy. This is the non-communists, the nationalists, as to how to handle this question of the Soviet Union, who were allies of Canada at that time. This was very, very difficult. They were not really allowed to speak out openly against Soviet rule in Ukraine because it looked like they would be supporting the Nazis if they did so. So what they did was withdraw from politics generally and put their efforts into culture. And in 1944, the Ukrainian National Federation of Canada founded the Ukrainian Cultural and Education Center in Winnipeg, or Oseretic, which means center. And here's a picture of it as it appears today. It is one of the most important archival, art, and cultural centers of all the Ukrainians in Canada. It has a very good library and a very large archive, and it puts on art displays and all kinds of things like that. So very important. And it's symbolic of that second part of the war when the nationalists were not allowed to openly criticize the Soviet Union, but rather put their efforts into culture. And then the war ends, of course, and the Cold War starts, and we can have the next slide. Now, the Prime Minister during the war was Mackenzie King, William Lyon Mackenzie King. And just as the war had ended, a scandal broke out in Ottawa when a cipher clerk at the Soviet embassy defected to the West. This was very embarrassing for King, who sincerely thought that the Soviets were an ally. He couldn't imagine the Soviets actually spying on him and his government, but they were. And this guy brought proof of it. His name was Guzenko, Igor Guzenko. And he carried, when he left, he carried everything that he could out of the embassy with him. And he went to one of the government departments and he said, look, I'm defecting to the West. And they said, well, who are you? And what do you want with us? And And he was so disappointed, and they wouldn't give him protection. They wouldn't do anything for him. So he wandered around. Eventually, he went to the right department, and people saw right away its importance. They took it right to the prime minister, and Mackenzie King did the same thing. Said, "I don't want to see this stuff. This is embarrassing." But his underlings were more wise, and it was immediately reported to the Americans and to the British and taken seriously. And a spy ring was discovered, and they were trying to find nuclear secrets and all kinds of that sort of thing, infiltrate government and all that. And that was, many people believe, it's still in 1945, the beginnings of the Cold War. Now, the next prime minister continued during that Cold War, and his name was Louis Saint Laurent. And people called him Uncle too. They called him Uncle Louis. And he was a liberal like Mackenzie King. And the Ukrainians in Canada were strong liberals before the war and during the war. And after the war too, right through the 1950s to the end of the 1960s, to the end of the 1950s. And actually, two prime ministers had also held seats in Western Canada, in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. Mackenzie King held a seat there, and before him, Laurier. So they had some knowledge of what was going on out west and of Ukrainians and things like that. So this particular picture is a picture of the Cathedral of St. Vladimir in Olga in Winnipeg, as it appears now. But in the 1950s, Saint Laurent actually made a gesture toward the recognition of the Ukrainians in Canada and their importance by attending this church service, Eastern Rite Church service, Ukrainian church service, which was not usually done. It's a Catholic church, yes, but it's Eastern Rite, and he was a Roman Catholic. And he sort of, this gesture was really felt to be important at the time, a Roman Catholic attending a Greek Catholic church, and the prime minister at that. So that's why I put up this particular picture. Two other things should be mentioned in this regard. Saint Laurent was the man who really welcomed the third wave of Ukrainians to Canada, the so-called DP wave, the refugees fleeing communism in Eastern Europe, wound up at the end of the war in Germany, most of them in displaced persons camps. That's what DP means, displaced person. And he opened the doors to them, and over 100,000 came to Canada. Of those 100,000, there were about, I think it was about 150,000 actually, if not more. And there were about 35,000 Ukrainians in that particular group. So that's the third major wave to come to Canada. And they are important politically because they were primarily politically opponents of communism in the Soviet Union. And many of them had been members of the national movement. Some of them were quite militant. And they shifted the tenor of things among Ukrainian Canadians and became even more vociferous supporters of an independent Ukraine, and very active in opposing the old Ukrainian communists in Canada, who mostly dated from the first immigration, when they were still socialists before communism developed. So they were very, very important for that reason. Okay, now the next slide, I guess we can go to. So there was an election in 1957, and Saint Laurent lost the election, and a man from the West called John Diefenbaker won it. Now, Diefenbaker grew up among Ukrainians in Western Canada. He grew up in Saskatchewan, and he trained as a lawyer out west. He served in the First World War, but came back home at the end of it, became a lawyer, and founded a practice in a little village called Waukau, Saskatchewan. And this was right in the middle of the Poplar Belt, of the Ukrainian settlement belt. And he was a member of this football team that you see here. And he's the third person from the left in the back row. That's John Diefenbaker, John G. Diefenbaker. And he defeated Saint Laurent, and he was a conservative. And he had experienced some discrimination in Canada because of his German name. And so when he came to power, one of his dreams was a Canadian Bill of Rights forbidding people to discriminate on the basis of ethnicity or religion or nationality or anything like that. So it was a Bill of Rights, Canadian Bill of Rights. It was criticized at the time because it was a mere statute, just an ordinary law passed by Parliament. It wasn't constitutional. But Canada at that time did not have a constitution. Our constitution was in Great Britain. So he did whatever he could, but of course, he couldn't pass a law in Britain. He couldn't change the constitution, but he passed a law in Canada. And then he was reelected in the next year, and he got a huge majority, wiped out the Liberals, really. And from that time on, the majority of Ukrainians out west, who are mostly wheat farmers and farmers generally, they voted for Diefenbaker, you know, and little old ladies at political meetings would say, he's nosh, you know, he's ours. So that's John G. Diefenbaker. Meanwhile, in Europe, all kinds of things are happening. Can we have the next slide, please? So there we have it. That's the headline of Nowy Szlach, the nationalist newspaper. And it reads, the headline reads at the top, Diefenbaker's Statut Praw, means Bill of Rights, I guess we could say, has become the law of the land, Staatszakonom. And there you see a picture of Diefenbaker in the upper right-hand corner there with the article, a big article about it. And Szlach was quite attuned to the political climate of that time and pointed out this problem of Canada not having the Constitution at home here, and that this being statute law and not constitutional law. So Diefenbaker had this idea of standing up for common people. He fought for the teaching of French in Saskatchewan schools. You know, minority languages were not encouraged. In fact, during the First World War, the bilingual Ruthenian English school system, which existed in the province of Manitoba, was suppressed. I believe that was in 1916. Very, very important development, because had it survived, there would have been Ukrainian speakers, large numbers of Ukrainian speakers, right through to the present. But this suppression of the Ukrainian language during the war meant that there were not public schools to carry on the tradition of Ukrainian language. There weren't positions in the school system to support teachers and things like that. And the result was a drastic decline in the speaking of Ukrainian among the children and grandchildren of the first immigration. People like myself, who grew up without the language. I had to learn it in university. And this is the dominant kind of culture out west, is that prairie culture, that pioneer culture, and highly assimilated in general. I'll come to this later, this business of ways of immigration. But anyhow, this is Diefenbaker and his commitment to human rights. He defended the blacks in South Africa, and he defended the Ukrainians at the United Nations as well. So can we have the next slide? Now, the Soviet Union at that time, after the death of Stalin, was in turmoil for a while. And this fellow on the left with the glasses, a little bit darkened, was the head of the old secret police. His name was Lavrenti Beria. He was a Georgian like Stalin. And there was a Politburo ruling Russia. That's a committee of a number of members. I forget how many members. There's probably about 10 or 12 of them. But they were all afraid of Beria, because Beria had executed so many people during Stalin's time, and they were afraid that he would take over, but they didn't know how to get rid of him. The man who figured out how to get rid of them was Nikita Khrushchev, and he's the man on the right there. And what he did was he made an alliance with General Zhukov, a war hero in the Soviet Union. And one day the Zhukov soldiers came to the building where the Politburo was supposed to meet and arrested Beria and took him away before his guards could defend him. And then he was shot a few months later, and Khrushchev took over. So this is Nikita Khrushchev. He was the former, I think it was first secretary of the Communist Party of Ukraine before he went to Moscow. So he had lots of Ukrainian experience. He was born close to the border of Soviet Ukraine, near Kursk, you know, just the other side of the border. It used to be called Slobodska Ukraina, or Sloboda Ukraine. It used to be part of that Sloboda Ukraine, and that's where he comes from. But we don't really know about his ancestry, and there's not that much discussion of it. I consulted a couple of biographies, and nobody seems to talk about it. So I asked people from the Soviet Union themselves, who was he? Was he Ukrainian or Russian or what? And some of them said, oh, yes, he was Ukrainian. There's no doubt. Everybody knows he's Ukrainian. You know, he was the first secretary of the party, et cetera, et cetera. He used to love wearing Ukrainian shirts, embroidered shirts, and that sort of thing. So that's Khrushchev. But really, we don't quite know. But he did have a soft spot for Ukrainians. That much we know. He was really a ruthless apparatchik serving Stalin, and was responsible for the deaths of many, many Ukrainians. But after Stalin died, he seemed to change, and this affection for Ukrainians began to come out a little bit. And he released many, many people from the Gulag when they came home. I've interviewed some of them. I've talked to some of them, children of those people who were exiled to Siberia. Some of the children were born in Siberia and then returned to Ukraine in the early 1960s, thanks to Khrushchev. So that's Khrushchev. But at this time, Khrushchev, the Cold War was already well underway, and Khrushchev went to the United Nations in 1960, in September or October of 1960, where he tried to make an alliance with the new non-aligned emerging nations, people who had just been granted independence by Great Britain or by France. And the most important of these was India itself, which became a republic, which the British were disappointed by, but they did become an independent state and a republic. And Khrushchev tried to make an alliance with India and the other so-called non-aligned nations. And this was the time when Cuba was leaning towards the Soviets, and Fidel Castro came to that meeting in September of 1960, and many others as well. So Khrushchev made a speech, very important speech, attacking the West for being colonialists and imperialists. And Eisenhower, who was the president of the United States, and Macmillan, who was the prime minister of Britain, didn't quite know what to do about this and how to respond. And Eisenhower was sick anyhow, and he was tired. He had a bad heart. He had already spoken, and he didn't want to speak again. So it fell to the next speaker from the West, from an important country, to respond to Khrushchev, and that was John G. Diefenbaker. So can we have the next slide, please? There he is, Diefenbaker, on the left, sitting with the Canadian delegation at the 15th session of the General Assembly of the United Nations in September of 1960. He got up, he responded to Khrushchev, and in a very fiery speech, very strong speech, he condemned the Soviet Union itself for being imperialist. And he said, Britain has just granted 14, Britain and France have just, and Holland too, have granted 14 of their former colonies independence, and they're sitting right here in the United Nations, and there's more to come. So he responded that way, and he contrasted this to the Soviet situation, where everybody was under the thumb of Moscow pretty much. And he said that, why don't you have free elections like we have here? If you had a free election, then people would vote for independence and they'd throw away communism. And he made specific reference to, quote, the freedom-loving Ukrainians. Okay, now Khrushchev seems to have had an inkling of what Diefenbaker was going to say, and he boycotted his speech, as did Gromyko, the foreign minister. But the representative of the Soviet Union who was left there got up and left in the middle of it. And it was a big to-do in the American media and everything. And it was attack particularly concerning the Ukrainian question in the Soviet Union. And this really affected Khrushchev very, very deeply. Can we have the next slide, please? This is the period. This is the time when Khrushchev basically blows his top at the UN, and he interrupted Macmillan when he spoke a few days later. He interrupted Dag Hammarskjöld as well, accused the West of all kinds of things, and said that all the colonial peoples will rise up, only we stand with the colonial peoples, and that sort of thing. And he condemned imperialism and colonialism of the West. And he attacked, and he at this time he actually didn't stand alone, but he invited his colleague from Soviet Ukraine, the representative of the Soviet Ukrainian Republic. I think he was the premier of the Soviet Republic. His name was Podgorny in Russian, Pidhirny in Ukrainian, to speak and reply to Khrushchev directly. But anyhow, Khrushchev did this, and then about a week or two later, a Philippine delegate repeated Diefenbaker's remarks about the freedom-loving peoples of Eastern Europe, and Khrushchev just went crazy and took off his shoe and banged it on his desk. Iconic moment in the history of the Cold War, and it all had to do with the Ukrainian question. Khrushchev was especially sensitive to it, and the Ukrainian Canadians had actually lobbied Diefenbaker to talk about it at the UN. Father Kushnir, in particular, who was the head of KUK, the Ukraine Canadian Committee, as it was called at that time, lobbied Diefenbaker. Diefenbaker did it, and this was the result. Okay, Khrushchev blows his top. Next slide, please. Now, this is Podgorny, Pidhirny. He's a congenial fellow. So let's just read what it says here. Nikolai Podgorny, Ukrainian orthography or spelling, Mykola Pidhirny. Khrushchev responded to Diefenbaker's critique of Soviet nationality policy by ordering the first secretary of the Ukrainian SSR, Mykola Pidhirny, to reply directly to the Canadian PM, and to do so in the Ukrainian and not the Russian language. This was very important because until that time, Russian was the language, the official language of all things international in the Soviet Union, and continued to be right until the end of the Soviet Union. And this was the first break with that Stalinist policy. He spoke in Ukrainian language to the United Nations. And he accused Diefenbaker of posing as a false liberator of the Ukrainians, and he referenced the theoretical sovereignty of the Ukrainian SSR. So there we have it. That's Pidhirny, and that's the clash at the United Nations. And this is about a year before the Cuban Missile Crisis, which follows. And of course, it's the hottest and most dangerous months of the Cold War. And the Ukrainian question and the Ukrainian Canadians were part of it. So that's Pidhirny, Diefenbaker, Kushnir, and the Ukrainian Canadians. Next slide, please. Well, Diefenbaker is eventually defeated, and a man by the name of Lester B. Pearson becomes prime minister. He was a liberal. He had lost the support of Ukrainians in Western Canada. Liberals, Ukrainians out west, started to vote conservative at that time. So he had a minority government, but he held on to power, and he did many good things. He expanded social services, expanded the old age pension, kind of twisted the arms of the provinces into accepting Medicare. So he did some good things. Internationally, he was less active. He had received the Nobel Prize for Peace, the Nobel Peace Prize, before becoming prime minister for some interventions with regard to Israel and Egypt, and working out the end of the 1956 war there. So he was a Nobel Prize winner, and he was wanted to stand for peace on the international stage. So Canada's position was different from that of the United States, which got itself involved in Vietnam, first the Korean War, and then Vietnam, and Canada stood aside from that Vietnam conflict. This enabled Canada to hold the Expo 67, the World's Fair in Montreal, and to invite the Soviets to attend. And they did in a big way, and they had a huge exhibition. So, and everybody wanted to compare the Soviet pavilion with the Canadian and with the American. And both the Soviet and the American pavilions were impressive. The Soviets had all kinds of things inside. It was just stuffed with things, consumer products, the space race, all that sort of thing. Sputnik, of course, was a Soviet achievement. Yuri Gagarin, first man in space. This was all under Khrushchev. Not to be outdone, the Americans had a beautiful pavilion, but it was not quite as full as the Soviet one, but it too emphasized the space race, and they eventually won it when, in the summer of 1969, the Americans and not the Soviets landed on the moon and brought their people home safely afterwards. So that's Lester B. Pearson. And so he was less vociferous on Cold War questions than Diefenbaker had been. But Diefenbaker himself was no Cold Warrior. He actually was the one who first sold Canadian wheat to Red China against the American desires. And then he did the same thing with Khrushchev. He arranged with Khrushchev to sell wheat to the Soviet Union. And Pearson took advantage of that, and the deal was carried through under Pearson himself. So that's Pearson, the 1960s. Meanwhile, there's a national crisis building up in Canada. The French in Quebec are very restless. There's an independence movement among them. There's a leftist independence movement. There's bombs placed in federal post boxes, this sort of thing. And it was just getting worse and worse. And nobody knew how to handle it. You probably recall from your Canadian history lessons that at that time, Charles de Gaulle came to Canada and spoke French and said, "Vive le Québec libre, vive le Québec libre." And people in Montreal just went wild. So there was a real chance that the country would break up over this national question. We didn't know how to handle it exactly. So Pearson brought some guys who had ideas about how to handle it from Quebec into the federal government. One of them was Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Can we have the next slide, please? And there he is, elected first head of the Liberal Party, and then next year, or the same year actually, 1968, Prime Minister of Canada in an election which he won. He had a majority government, and his ideas were just as Diefenbaker's were a little bit right of center, his were left of center. So he wanted to extend a hand to the underdeveloped world, the third world as it was called at the time, and developing world as it's called today, and also the Soviet bloc, the Eastern Bloc as it was called. He wanted to warm up relations with the Soviet Union. And the Ukrainians in Canada didn't like this, especially the nationalist organizations like the UNF. And now there was, among the DPs, there was a new organization called the League for the Liberation of Ukraine, the Canadian League for the Liberation of Ukraine. And they were even stronger than the old UNF. So they didn't like this sort of thing. And there was objections to Trudeau's new policy. Next slide, please. Nonetheless, he carried it out, and he made a deal with the Soviets. And he, after things had calmed down in 1970, you recall in 1970 there was the October crisis in Canada, and the year before that there was or 2 years before that there was the crisis in Europe, 1968. There were revolutions all over Europe. Most of them failed. Including that of Alexander Dubček in Czechoslovakia. There was the Prague Spring. And Trudeau didn't say much about that. He stayed out of that pretty much. The government was fairly quiet. Why? Because he wanted to make up with the Soviet Union, and these types of things got in the way. So anyhow, he, when things had calmed down, he suggested he could tour the Soviet Union. He wanted to tour the Soviet Union and meet the leaderships face to face. And he arranged to do this in the spring of 1971. And in May of 1971, he visited Moscow. And this is a picture of Trudeau on the right. Next to him, behind him there, is his translator, Walter Deakin, a Ukrainian Canadian from Toronto. Across from him is Alexei Kosygin, the Soviet premier of the time. And fourth one down the table from Kosygin, you can't see, I don't know who the second one is or the third, his face is away, but the fourth is Andrei Gromyko, the foreign minister. And behind Trudeau and Deakin are pictures of Karl Marx. You can't see the one behind Trudeau, but it's Lenin himself. And they had negotiations and they prepared to sign some agreements in Moscow. And then the next day, Trudeau flew south to Ukraine. Next slide, please. And this is a picture of Pierre Trudeau and his new wife, Margaret. They were just married, landing in Kiev, or Kyiv, as it's called in Ukrainian, in May of 1971. And it's springtime in the city, springtime in Ukraine, very nice. People were more relaxed. The atmosphere was very different from Moscow, which was very official. Ukraine was a bit more easygoing, and Ukrainians really welcomed Pierre Trudeau and his wife. And the Soviets in particular were very taken with Margaret, his wife. She was very beautiful and very young at the time. I think she was about 20 years younger, 25 years younger than Trudeau himself. And we're quite impressed by her. And here you can see her wearing a scarf, or a huska, as it's called in Ukrainian, or a babushka, as we used to call it in Western Canada, a headscarf. And they're getting off the plane and landing in the city there. The thing went very well. The visit to Kiev went very well. But then he took off and went to Tashkent in Central Asia to visit that part of the Soviet Union. Then he toured the north. And he made a remark about how the Soviets had developed the North and we should imitate them. And he particularly admired the city of Norilsk in the north. This caused a furor back in Canada because Trudeau didn't know it at the time, but Norilsk was actually built by the slave labor of the Gulag prisoners. And many, many of them were Ukrainians. And there, about 20 years before Trudeau arrived, there was a huge rebellion among these slave laborers from the Gulag building Norilsk, and many of them were killed. So it was kind of scandalous for Trudeau to talk that way about Norilsk, but he did, and he paid for it when he got back to Canada. Next slide, please. So there was a lot of discussion about this, about Trudeau kind of sucking up to the Soviets like that and being so soft on them. And the Ukrainians were leading the charge, of course. And this was a picture of Father Kouchner, the chairman of the Ukrainian-Canadian Community, and the Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau. During the summer that year, they got together. There was a committee of Ukrainian Canadians got together with the Prime Minister and explained to him their concerns. And he said, well, they specifically zeroed in on this one question of the dissidents. And Trudeau had replied to criticism in Parliament by saying, well, I'm not going to say anything to the Soviets about this, because if I said, why do you imprison dissidents, they'll tell us, why do you imprison FLQ separatists in Canada, And this comparison made the news all over the country, was greatly objected to by all kinds of Ukrainian organizations. And so a delegation went to Ottawa, and that's what this article is about. It, I believe, is from a Winnipeg paper called Ukrainsky Holos. And the headline there reads, Konferencja Ukraińców z Premierem Kanady. And what happened at this meeting is a bit controversial because Trudeau refused to apologize. He said, well, I'm sorry if you feel that way, it's unfortunate, but that's the way it is, I'm not going to withdraw my remarks. So when they came out of the meeting, the press swarmed around the Ukrainians and around Kouchner in particular and said, well, what happened there? What happened in this meeting? And Kouchner didn't know what to say because on the one hand, Trudeau stood his ground. On the other hand, he said, well, I'm sorry for not, if you feel that way, So he didn't know what to say. So they turned to another delegate, named Anthony Yaramovich from Winnipeg, like Kushner. And they asked him, and he was the same. He didn't know what to say. And then a third member of the delegation stood up. I think his name was Maximovich or Maximich or something like that. He was a lawyer from Toronto. And he said, well, the prime minister apologized and everything is well now, and we're satisfied with the apology. And that's the headline that got spread across the country. I guess it was on CBC, but it's certainly in the newspapers because I've seen it. And that's the story. And also, the KGB was watching. And recently somebody sent me a report from Kiev about this incident, and it said that the KGB basically swallowed the story about Trudeau apologizing. So the whole world believed it, but that's not exactly what happened. And that's what this particular meeting in Ottawa was all about. Next slide, please. So in reply to Trudeau's trip to the Soviet Union, the Soviets agreed to send Kosygin to Canada. So Kosygin was going to make a tour of Canada. And Trudeau was very concerned about what the Ukrainians were up to. They could make a lot of trouble for him. And and this is part of it. This is the Ukrainian Canadian Students Union, SUSK as it's called, its acronym in Ukrainian, protesting before his hotel in Winnipeg, where he was about to speak to that same Ukrainian Canadian committee or Congress. And everybody was concerned that he speak to the Soviets about dissidents and defend the dissidents and get what he could from them, and that he toughen up his line on the Soviet Union generally and not give away too much for free. So this was going on, and Trudeau was concerned about it. At the same time, there was a national question. There was a French-English conflict and the French-English tensions, and Trudeau had to face that. And during Pearson's day, there was a Royal Commission on this matter, and the Royal Commission came up with this word called multiculturalism. They probably got it from Paul Yuzik, who was campaigning in Parliament for it. It was his maiden speech in the Parliament. He used this word, called Canada a multicultural country. So that was in the air too. So, but it was the policy of the government to that day to promote bilingualism and biculturalism, not multiculturalism, bilingualism and biculturalism. So here he's going to Winnipeg after announcing multiculturalism in Parliament, change in policy. He's going to Winnipeg to address the Ukrainians directly. Okay, next slide, please. And this is a clip from Trudeau speaking to the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. There you can see Kushner sitting at the front there. And you can see the trezub, the trident symbol. And that's Trudeau standing there, delivering his speech. In this speech, he announces multiculturalism again, adds some new details, and says, well, he will speak to the Soviets about dissidents, not necessarily about from a political point of view, but from a humanitarian point of view. So everybody is delighted by this. He gets wild applause, and it was really, really a wonderful evening for everybody involved. And Senator Yuzik was there, and Yaroslav Rudnitsky from the commission was there. John Diefenbaker was there. So it was a very, very important meeting when multiculturalism was first announced. And Trudeau hoped that this multiculturalism concession would quiet the Ukrainians on the eve of Kosygin's visit to Canada. Next slide, please. And there is another picture. This is from Kanadiyski Farmer, again, Canadian farmer, October 18th, 1971. Trudeau speaks to the Ukrainian Canadian Congress announcing multiculturalism, official multiculturalism, and promising to speak to the Soviet leader Alexei Kosygin about Ukrainian political prisoners in the USSR. Okay, next slide, please. Now, part of this problem between Trudeau and the Ukrainians was his general attitude towards the national question, both in the Soviet Union and in Canada, because Trudeau was basically internationalist. He was a federalist, and he wanted to see federalism preserved, both in Canada and it seems that also in the Soviet Union. So in order to tell him more about the problems of the peoples of the Soviet Union, Paul Yuzik, who is in the center there facing the camera, arranges for on behalf of the Ukrainian community of Canada to give the Prime Minister the 2 volumes of just published by the University of Toronto Press of Ukraine, a concise encyclopedia. And that's what this picture is, presenting the Prime Minister. And the newspaper says, and I think there's some irony in it, he stated, so that he will know Ukraine better. In other words, don't say such silly things about the Gulag and all of this. So that's Trudeau, that's Senator Yuzik, supposedly the 2 founding fathers of Canadian multiculturalism, having to do with the Ukrainian question and the national question on both sides of the Atlantic. Next slide, please. Well, Kosygin does come to Canada about a week or 2 later, but lo and behold, there was no peace. Not only Ukrainians, but all kinds of different groups protested the arrival of Kosygin in Canada during this very tense Cold War period. And the most outstanding groups, however, I think were probably the Ukrainians, the Hungarians, and the Jews. The Jews had a slogan, "Let my people go." They wanted freedom of movement for the Jewish people of the Soviet Union to leave if they wanted, or go to Israel or come to the West or whatever. And so they were protesting against Kosygin. The Ukrainians were protesting for civil rights and human rights in the Soviet Union and national rights too. The Hungarians were protesting because they had been put down in 1956 by a Soviet invasion and many of them forced into exile. And this picture is a scuffle before the Parliament buildings in Ottawa. And that's Kosygin in the middle. And you can see he's being pushed down by a Hungarian demonstrator who actually jumped on top of him, tried to bring him to the ground. His name, the name of this fellow was, I think it was Matei. I shouldn't. I'll mangle it. But he did succeed in disrupting the thing. Trudeau really blew his top, got mad at him. I think he was arrested afterwards, but I'm not sure. But it was the first of a very, very rough reception for Kosygin in Canada. There was actually bombs placed near the Soviet embassy. Kosygin didn't dare go to the Soviet embassy. He stayed in the Hotel Laurier instead. The Soviets booked a whole floor of the Hotel Laurier instead of going to the Soviet embassy. And this happened in Ottawa. But the biggest demonstrations of all happened in Toronto, where mounted policemen charged into the crowds and a lot of people were hurt. There was an inquiry afterwards, and the priests were reprimanded for doing this. And so that was a very, very tense result of this visit to Canada. Next slide, please. There you have an American view of all of this. This is from Kanadayski Farmer as well. But it's reprinting a cartoon from the Christian Science Monitor in Boston, who noticed all of this and made international headlines this visit. And there you can see, and I'll just read what I have here. Caricature of the Kosygin tour by the Christian Science Monitor. A beaten and battered Trudeau and Kosygin limp along with explosions and shrapnel all around them. The captions read, Hungarian protests, Quebec separatist movement, air hijacking, Jewish protest, and in the top left-hand corner, minority squabbles. And I think this last one refers to the question of biculturalism versus multiculturalism. And multiculturalism, of course, was Trudeau's response to these protests and his development of how to handle Canadian identity and the French-English question and the Ukrainian question all at the same time. Next slide, please. But while in Ottawa, Trudeau did sign, they formalized it in Ottawa, and they signed an agreement on cultural, scientific, and sporting exchanges. And the most famous of these, of course, is the Canada-USSR hockey series of 1972, the following year. Everybody forgets what happened in 1971, but they all remember 1972 and the goals scored by Henderson in overtime in the last game. And Canada won the series, and it was treated as a great victory for capitalism over communism. But anyhow, that was the agreement signed. There were also education agreements as a result of this exchange. The University of Saskatchewan opened an exchange with Chernihiv University in Western Ukraine. And there were other exchanges as well: sports, education, science. So that's the end of it. Next slide, please. And then finally, we have Trudeau's eventual successor, Brian Mulroney. Brian Mulroney returned somewhat to the policies of Diefenbaker, is very friendly to Ukrainians. He speaks at the Ukrainian World Congress in Toronto during the first election, where he was elected prime minister. And thereafter, he's very, very positive in his policy. He appoints Ray Natishin, Governor General of Canada. And there are many East Europeans in his parliament, not only Natishin, but Mazankowski from Alberta, and Jake Epp from Manitoba, who is a Mennonite Ruslander background from Ukraine, I believe. So Mulroney is aware of this, and his policy shifts a little bit. Trudeau had agreed to have multiculturalism, and he gave some small grants to Ukrainians and other ethnic groups for cultural activities like folk dancing and things like that. Mulroney changed this policy somewhat, as conservatives usually do. They want to save money. So what he did was he said he would appoint more ethnics to government posts, and he did, and his cabinet revealed it. Very heavy representation of East Europeans and Ukrainian, including Ukrainians, in his cabinet. And he visited Soviet Ukraine in 1989. And again, in 1991, when Ukraine declared its state independence, Canada was the second country in the world and the first country from the Western Alliance to recognize Ukrainian independence. And he did this against the wishes of George Bush, the father, who was worried about proliferation of nuclear weapons and things like that, and didn't care too much for Ukrainian independence. So Mulroney stood up for the Ukrainians, recognized Ukraine and independent Ukraine, and there have been good relations between independent Ukraine and Canada ever since. So just to recap, let me say that there are two or three really important points that I make here. One, first of all, the Ukrainians became Ukrainians in Canada, not in Europe. The first immigration was not, quote, Ukrainian. It was Galician and Ruthenian before the national identity had congealed. There were small groups who were aware of it, but in general, it was before and not after the identity congealed. And the first, this is quite clear if you look at the various censuses of Canada, because there are lots of Galicians. There were about 170. It's been 170,000. It's been estimated before at the eve of the First World War, but this had grown to quarter of a million by the 1920s and 1930s. And by 1936, I believe, there were no more Ruthenians in Canada. They were all Ukrainians. So it shows that the 1920s, it was the period that, in the 1930s, that Ukrainians adopted their national identity, Ukrainian Canadian, here in Canada. Secondly, the Ukrainian Canadians were at the center of one of the most iconic events of the Cold War, Khrushchev blowing his top at the United Nations. And Kushner and Diefenbaker were very much involved with that. And Khrushchev did it largely because he was especially vulnerable on the Ukrainian question, especially interested in the Ukrainian question, identified with Ukraine somewhat, and was affected by it emotionally. Next, multiculturalism as a national ideology and part of the Canadian national identity was largely an achievement of the Ukrainian Canadians and not any other ethnic groups. They led the pack. They led the charge, not any other ethnic groups, and certainly not the Prime Minister, who was dragging his heels the whole way. Trudeau is known as the father of Canadian multiculturalism, but really the laurels should go to the Ukrainian activists who fought so very hard for it, including those students in Winnipeg and those politicians in Ottawa and elsewhere. So multiculturalism as a Ukrainian-Canadian achievement. And then, of course, there is the fact that Canada was the first Western country to recognize Ukrainian independence in 1991. And that, I think, was, like multiculturalism, was an achievement of all three waves, first three waves of Ukrainians in Canada. The pioneer wave, the DP wave, which relied on the legitimacy of the pioneers, you know, as founding peoples out west, to get a fair share of the Canadian political pie. And so Ukrainian independence was recognized very quickly by Canada, and we have good relations to today. Okay, so that's it. Outline of Ukrainian-Canadian history during the 20th century, with an emphasis upon Canadian policy towards the Soviet Union's Ukrainian question. And I would be happy to take questions about this if there are any here in the audience. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.